The year is 1572. The date is August 24th. Midnight presses over Paris with the weight of a coffin lid. The streets are unnervingly quiet, each cobblestone slick with humidity and mist. The Seine flows sluggishly beneath a silvered moon, reflecting only the dim flicker of lanterns along its banks. Smoke curls from hearths, but tonight it smells of iron, of fear, of what is to come. In the gilded corridors of the Louvre, Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother to King Charles IX, has made her choice. The Huguenot nobles who travelled to Paris for the royal wedding of Margaret of Valois to Henri of Navarre are no longer honoured guests. They are prey. Their loyalty, their power, their faith, all marked for extinguishment. At the first hint of darkness, the city shudders. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny awakens to the sound of splintering wood. He had survived an earlier attempt on his life, but tonight, no protection will save him. Servants scramble to barricade doors, but their hands shake against inevitability. A shadow moves, a blade flashes. Coligny is struck and thrown into the courtyard below. Blood stains the cobblestones, mingling with the mist. Bells toll at Church Saint-Germain, not for prayer, but as a signal. Across Paris, men with swords, knives, and clubs move with precision. Houses are surrounded. Families awaken to screams that will haunt them forever. Some are killed instantly. Others are forced to watch their loved ones die. Parents try to shield their families, hiding behind doors and furniture as the attackers advance. Yet the tide of violence does not relent. By dawn, Paris has changed forever. This is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Not a battle between armies, but a war within a city, executed with precision, cruelty, and terror. Paris itself becomes a classroom of fear, a stage where loyalty and obedience are enforced with blood. The city's heart beats with the pulse of the slaughter, and nothing will ever be the same. If you've ever wondered why history praises crowns and forgets the streets soaked in blood, you're in the right place. Here on Brutal History, we dig up the real stories from anonymous graves under Parisian streets and witnesses who recorded the screams no king wanted remembered. Every view, every like, every subscription drags one more voice from the shadows. Now, let's return to the riverbanks and narrow alleys, because the massacre in Paris was only the beginning of a terror that would ripple through all of France. To understand why Paris burned, you must first understand the Huguenots. Born from the flames of the Protestant Reformation, they were men and women who dared to question the authority of the Church, who read scripture in their own tongue, who gathered in secret to worship a God without intermediaries. By the mid-16th century, they had grown into a powerful minority across France. Wealthy merchants, educated nobles, and influential advisors to kings. Their faith was not only a spiritual choice, but a political one. Each Huguenot oath, each congregation, each whispered prayer in hidden chapels was seen as defiance by the crown and a challenge to the Catholic hierarchy. Paris, the heart of royal power, had long been wary of their presence. Catherine de' Medici was no devout queen acting on piety. She was a political architect, a mother shaping her son's reign, and a woman who understood that the threat of Huguenot influence could topple dynasties. France, in 1572, was a kingdom fractured by war, weakened by decades of civil conflict, and haunted by religious schisms that ran deeper than any crown could hope to control. For decades, tension had festered between Catholics and Protestants, between the royal court and ambitious nobles, between the old guard and a generation that demanded change. The Huguenots had risen not only as a religious movement, but as a political force. Leaders like Admiral Gaspard de Coligny had influence over King Charles IX, whispering counsel and pressing for reforms that threatened the traditional order. Meanwhile, the Catholic League, loyal to the Crown and the Old Faith, watched every Protestant victory with suspicion, preparing to strike. France's wars of religion were endless. Small skirmishes erupted across the country, towns changed hands, and alliances were fragile. The Crown's finances were stretched thin, drained by campaigns against Protestant strongholds in the south, by the need to secure loyalty in distant provinces, and by lavish courtly displays intended to reinforce the image of power. The monarchy owed debts to Huguenot financiers, to Catholic nobles, to foreign allies. Suspicion and fear grew alongside the mounting bills. Catherine understood the precarious position of her son. Charles IX, young and indecisive, was surrounded by competing factions. Protestant influence, particularly through Coligny, threatened to tilt the balance of power. It was not enough to negotiate. It was not enough to delay. A decisive action was required, one that would neutralize the Huguenot leadership and reinforce the Crown's dominance over Paris. The royal wedding between Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre provided the perfect opportunity. The Huguenot elite would be gathered in one city, surrounded by loyal troops and seemingly under the protection of the Crown. And yet, this protection was a lie. Beneath the surface, plans had already been made. Couriers moved between the Louvre and loyal captains stationed throughout Paris, carrying instructions. Lists of prominent Huguenots were prepared. Signals were agreed upon. The tolling of the bells at Church Saint-Germain would mark the beginning, and the city itself would become an instrument of terror. Ordinary citizens were enlisted, willingly or coerced, to participate in the slaughter. The city would act as a single organism, executing the will of the Queen Mother, moving in calculated waves of violence. The night began in the most targeted fashion. Coligny, the figurehead of the Huguenot cause, was the first to be struck. Earlier attempts on his life had failed, leaving him wounded but still alive and still influential. This time, there would be no escape. A shadow moves through his chamber, a sword flashes, and he is thrown from his window into the courtyard below. His blood soaks the cobblestones, mingling with the mist that lingers over Paris. It is the first death in a chain that will consume the city. As the bells toll, men move through the streets with unflinching purpose. Swords, knives, clubs, and pikes strike without hesitation. Houses are surrounded. Families awaken to screams. The city itself has become a predator. Dogs feed openly on corpses left in alleyways. The Seine begins to carry the bodies downstream, the current taking them silently through the heart of the city. By mid-morning, the carnage spreads. Courtiers in the Louvre track each death as if reading a ledger. Every murder is a lesson in obedience. Priests march with mobs, offering prayers to sanctify the killings. Huguenot leaders are executed first, their heads displayed publicly to ensure the lesson is clear. Defiance will be met with death. Ordinary citizens who had once lived peacefully now become killers, their fear and zeal intertwining in grotesque symphony. Even children and the elderly are not spared. The streets are rivers of terror. Mothers scream as their children are torn from hiding. Fathers are struck down before they can resist. Survivors wander aimlessly, haunted by what they have seen. Every alley, every courtyard, every corner becomes a killing field. The city itself seems to suffocate beneath the weight of its own violence. By late afternoon, the city had become a labyrinth of smoke and fire. Streets that once carried merchants and children now carried the weight of bodies, piles of clothing, shattered furniture, and ash. The Seine flowed sluggishly, carrying corpses downstream, their pale faces reflecting the dying light. But Paris was not silent. The sounds of the massacre persisted in whispers of fear, distant shrieks, the echo of boots on cobblestones, and the creak of doors being forced open in search of the last holdouts. In the Marais and Faubourg Saint-Antoine districts, families had barricaded themselves in basements and attics. Some barricades held for hours, even days, giving temporary respite. One account tells of a father hiding with his children in a wine cellar, listening as neighbors were dragged screaming from their homes above. He counted each passing hour with trembling hands, praying that the soldiers would move on. When they finally arrived, the cellar doors were broken open, and the family's survival depended on quick thinking. The father claimed they were Catholic sympathizers, a lie that saved their lives, but left them haunted by guilt for years to come. In the upper quarters, nobles fared little better. Houses of prominent Huguenots were stormed with methodical precision. Henri de Condé and his men were cut down while attempting to flee through hidden passages in the Louvre. Their heads were paraded through the streets as grim trophies, warnings for anyone who might harbor rebellion. Meanwhile, loyal Catholic soldiers ensured that the orders from Catherine de' Medici were executed without delay. No high-ranking Huguenot could escape, and those with influence were struck first to break morale across the city. The crown also sought to manipulate perception. Reports of spontaneous uprisings were circulated to suggest the massacre was the will of the people, not the orchestration of the court courtiers and priests composed letters praising the divine sanction of the killings, masking the calculated political maneuver behind layers of religious rhetoric. Meanwhile, ordinary Parisians were recruited to assist, often under duress, turning neighbors into executioners and ensuring that fear spread not just through the victims, but through the city's entire population. As night fell, isolated pockets of resistance were extinguished. Soldiers moved house to house, while fire and smoke cleared hiding places. One house on Rue de la Ferronnerie held a dozen men and women, armed with makeshift weapons. After a tense standoff, flames were set to the building, forcing those inside into the open. There, the soldiers met them with swords and pikes. Few survived, and those who did were dragged through the streets to witness the fates of others. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors, if they survived at all, were left to wander the city in shock. Children who had hidden in attics emerged to find parents missing, streets littered with corpses, and the sound of dogs scavenging mothers and fathers who had survived the initial assault now faced a city transformed into a place of distrust and suspicion. Trust itself had been weaponized. Neighbors had turned on neighbors. Religious zeal had justified murder, and fear had replaced safety. Beyond Paris, the aftermath rippled through France. Cities like Orléans, Lyon, and Bordeaux reported similar waves of violence as local authorities sought to preempt Huguenot uprisings. Tens of thousands would perish in the weeks that followed. The massacre achieved its political goal. The Huguenot leadership was decapitated and the crown's dominance was asserted. Yet the cost was incalculable. Generations of families were erased. Communities were fractured. Faith had been corrupted into a tool of terror. The memory of that August would linger for decades, shaping attitudes toward authority, religion, and survival. Letters and diaries that survived capture the raw human horror. A Venetian ambassador wrote of the Seine, choked with corpses, and the streets clogged with the bodies of children and nobles alike. One anonymous survivor recorded hiding under floorboards, listening to the screams above, emerging only when silence fell like a shroud, and realizing the city had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The horror was total, leaving Paris haunted long after the fires died and the bodies were removed. The massacre's legacy was not just death. It was betrayal, fear, and a lesson that power could be enforced through terror. Survivors were forced to navigate a city where trust had been destroyed, families annihilated, and neighbors turned against neighbors. The young would grow up carrying the memory of that night, shaping their faith and their choices, teaching subsequent generations the price of political and religious defiance. You've walked through the streets of Paris in August 1572. The narrow alleys, the riverbanks, the hidden cellars where screams were swallowed by darkness. If this reminds you how fragile life and faith can be, subscribe to Brutal History and keep the past alive. Some voices deserve to echo even from the grave, especially then. The Huguenots were meant to vanish. Families erased, homes burned, futures stolen. But they didn't. Their story survives in letters, in fragments of witness accounts, in the silent testimony of the streets and the Seine. And now it lives in you, because you listened, remembered, and refused to let the terror of that night have the last word. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome.